Working as a nurse at St. Emory's Hospital in the dead middle of nowhere, Nevada, is not just a job. It's a test of how much fear a person can truly endure before something inside them breaks forever. Because in this place, behind every half-shut door and darkened hallway, something ancient and unnatural waits in the stale, heavy air. And some nights when I'm moving from room to room with only the flickering overhead lights to guide me, I can feel icy fingers brushing against my neck and hear faint whispering in languages no human tongue should ever speak. And even now, after everything I've seen, there are still nights when I have to squeeze my eyes shut and tell myself over and over that if I just keep walking and don't look back, maybe, just maybe, I will live to see the sunrise. Although deep down, I know that surviving here isn't about skill or luck or even courage. It's about knowing the rules. Rules that aren't written in any handbook or taught during any orientation. Rules that have been passed down from nurse to nurse in shaking whispers. Because if you break even one of them, no matter how small the mistake, something terrible will find you and drag you screaming into a place much worse than death. And I swear to you right now that there are things happening inside this hospital that no human being is meant to witness. And by the time you hear the last part of my story, you'll understand why so many of us would rather risk dying out there in the endless boiling desert than spend another night working these cursed halls. But if you want to know the whole horrifying truth, the thing none of us talk about, except in trembling breaths when we're sure the walls aren't listening, then you need to hear every word, right until the very end. The first time I was told about the rules was by a woman named Nurse Karen, an old, weathered lady with sunken eyes and a voice like dry leaves scraping across concrete, who cornered me on my first night as I was preparing to do my rounds. And before I could even introduce myself properly, she grabbed my wrist so hard it felt like my bones would snap and hissed. If you want to live past your first week, listen to me very carefully. And I remember standing there frozen, the fluorescent lights above us buzzing and popping, casting weird, twitching shadows on the walls as she leaned in so close that I could smell the bitter metallic tang of fear coming off her skin. And she whispered the 6 strange and terrifying rules to me, rules that even now make my stomach turn just thinking about them. The first rule: if you hear soft crying coming from room 209, no matter what, you must never, ever open the door, even if the cries sound like a child or someone you know personally. Because the thing that makes those sounds wears a face that looks exactly like someone you love. And if you open that door, it will follow you home. It will wait until you are alone, and then it will show you its true face, the face no living mind can survive seeing. The second rule: when doing your night rounds, if you pass by the ICU and see the lights flicker 3 times in rapid succession, you must immediately turn your back to the glass windows. Close your eyes and count backwards from 50 out loud without stopping, because if you so much as glimpse what is standing inside watching you, it will know that you have seen it. And from that moment on, it will do everything in its power to become a permanent part of you. The third rule: there is a gurney that moves on its own through the halls between midnight and dawn. And if you happen to hear its rusty wheels squeaking and turning behind you, you must never look at it directly. Instead, you must find the nearest room, enter it without hesitation, and hide under the bed until the sound is completely gone. Because if you dare to look at who or what is pushing it, you will feel their cold, slimy hands wrap around your ankles the next time you close your eyes to sleep, and you will never wake up again. The fourth rule: sometimes a patient will call out to you from their bed asking you to come closer, promising you they have a secret to tell you that will save your life. No matter how desperate or convincing they sound, you must not approach them, because if you step within 3 feet of their bed, you will fall into a trance, and your body will be used to do things that will make you pray for death long before your mind ever gets the mercy of it. The fifth rule: if you find a black feather lying in the middle of a perfectly clean hallway, you must pick it up immediately and burn it in the utility room's incinerator without saying a single word. Because if you leave it where it is, it will multiply, and for every feather that appears, another shadow will be born. And these shadows will crawl along the ceilings and walls, whispering your darkest fears back to you until your mind shatters like glass. The sixth rule: Once during every night shift, without warning, the intercom system will crackle to life and a calm, unfamiliar voice will announce, "Code Black, all staff to sublevel 3. And if you ever hear this announcement, no matter where you are or what you are doing, you must immediately cover your ears, shut your eyes, and remain absolutely still until the announcement stops. Because if you move even a little, the voice will notice you. And once it does, it will call you by name. And once it calls you by name, your soul will no longer belong to you." Nurse Karen made me repeat every rule back to her, word for word. And only after I did so to her satisfaction did she let go of my wrist. But not before muttering under her breath, "They're always listening, they're always waiting, and they always want more." And I remember feeling a shiver run down my spine so violently that my teeth actually chattered. But I tried to laugh it off, thinking maybe she was just trying to scare the new girl. Maybe it was some kind of sick hazing ritual. Although deep down, I could feel something heavy and wrong settling into my chest. Something that felt like invisible eyes locking onto me from somewhere high up in the dark, dusty rafters of that old, crumbling building. I wish I could tell you that I laughed it all off, that I didn't believe in any of it. But the very first night I broke one of the rules, without even realizing it. Something happened that changed my life forever. Something so horrifying, so unbelievable, that even now as I sit here telling you this story, I can still feel its icy breath against the back of my neck, still hear its fingernails dragging slowly down the length of the walls behind me. And if you think this is scary now, just wait, because what happened next was only the beginning. It started on my second night working at St. Emery's, when the air inside the hospital felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were sagging under some invisible, crushing weight. And every step I took down the long, dimly lit corridors seemed to echo too loudly, as though the building was listening, waiting for me to make a mistake. And the stale, chemical-soaked air burned my nostrils as I pushed my cart from room to room, checking vitals, delivering medications, pretending with every ounce of my being that I wasn't already starting to see things in the corners of my eyes. Faint figures that dissolved the moment I turned my head. And that night, the moment that changed everything, happened just after I passed by room 209. Because even though I knew the first rule by heart, even though Karen had all but screamed it into my skull, the moment I heard that soft, broken crying drifting from behind the door, a sound so heartbreakingly familiar, my brain shut off and my heart took over. Because the voice sounded exactly like my little sister, Lily, who had died 3 years ago in a car accident. I froze in the hallway, my hand hovering inches from the doorknob, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I almost didn't hear the faint scratching sound coming from beneath the door. And before I could stop myself, I whispered, "Lily?" Even though every fiber of my being screamed at me to run, to get away, because some instinct deep inside knew that whatever was making that sound was not my sister. But before I could move, before I could tear my eyes away, the door handle began to rattle and shake violently. And from the other side, the voice, my sister's voice, sobbed, "Please don't leave me. It's so cold, I'm so scared." And I swear to you, it was her. It was her voice exactly, every tremble, every pleading note. And in that moment, it didn't matter what Karen had told me. It didn't matter what every nerve in my body was shrieking. Because love, that cruel, blind love, made my hand close around the doorknob. Just as I started to turn it, just as I felt the mechanism click under my fingers, a rough hand slammed into my shoulder, yanking me backward so hard I nearly fell. And it was Nurse David, a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark rings under his eyes and a permanent scowl etched into his face, who growled in a low, furious whisper, "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" And without waiting for me to respond, he shoved me down the hallway away from room 209, his grip bruising my arm as he half-dragged me toward the break room, all while the sobbing voice behind the door rose in pitch, turning into a high, keening wail that made my blood run cold. Inside the break room, with the heavy door slammed shut behind us, Nurse David spun me around and got right in my face, his breath hot and sour, his eyes wide and wild as he hissed, "You almost killed us both." And when I stammered, trying to explain that it sounded exactly like my sister, he shook his head violently and said, That's how it gets you. It knows what you love. It knows what you miss the most. And if you open that door, you're not just letting it out, you're letting it in. And even though I could barely breathe from fear and shame, I nodded, too stunned to say anything else, as the distant sobbing finally faded into silence, leaving behind an emptiness that seemed to seep into the walls. After that, Nurse David made me sit in the corner while he paced the room like a caged animal, muttering to himself under his breath. And when I asked him what would have happened if I had opened the door, he stopped dead, turned to me with an expression so haunted it barely looked human, and said, "You wouldn't be you anymore," before turning away and refusing to say another word. And it was in that moment I realized that the rules weren't just superstitions or scare tactics. They were the only thin, fragile barrier between us and something much older, much crueler, that was hungry for more than just our lives. The rest of the shift passed in a haze of terror, every shadow seeming to stretch too long across the floor, every sudden creak of the old building making me jump out of my skin. And I stuck to Nurse David like a second shadow, terrified that if I so much as stepped out of sight for even a second, whatever was behind that door would find a way to reach me, to call my name again in that beloved, broken voice. And this time, I would not be strong enough to resist. By the time dawn finally began to leak weak and gray through the dirty windows, I felt like I had aged 10 years, my hands trembling so badly I could barely sign out at the front desk. And as I turned to leave, Karen appeared out of nowhere, her face drawn and pale, her eyes glittering with a strange, feverish intensity, as she grabbed my hand and pressed a small object into my palm. A matchbook, old and worn, with the hospital's logo stamped crookedly across the front, and whispered, "You're gonna need this sooner than you think," before disappearing down the hallway without another word. I stared down at the matchbook in my hand, feeling a deep, gnawing dread settle into my bones, because even though I didn't understand yet what she meant, some part of me knew it had something to do with the fifth rule, and that before long, I would be called upon to use it in a way that would test every last shred of sanity I still clung to. The moment I stepped outside into the blinding morning sun, I felt a strange sense of being watched, not from behind me, but from within me, like something had latched onto my shadow and was studying me from the inside out. And when I got home, I locked every door, checked every window, and sat awake for hours, staring at the dark corners of my apartment, jumping at every creak and groan of the settling building. Because no matter how tightly I wrapped myself in blankets, no matter how many lights I left burning, I could still hear it, the faint, wet sound of fingernails scratching along the walls, getting closer. That was the night I realized that once you break a rule, once you let them notice you, it doesn't end when your shift is over. It doesn't end when you clock out. They follow you. They find you. They wait for you to close your eyes and let your guard down. And when you do, they strike. And strike they did, but not the way I expected. Because the next time I went back to work, it wasn't room 209 that came for me. It was something much worse. Something waiting for me down the endless, flickering hallway that led straight past the ICU. And this time, there would be no one there to pull me back at the last second. The hallway past the ICU stretched out before me like a tunnel into some deeper, darker hell, the overhead fluorescent lights flickering weakly, sputtering as if they were struggling to stay alive themselves. And with every step I took, the hum of the fixtures grew louder, a buzzing so intense it felt like it was vibrating directly inside my skull, making my teeth ache. And as I approached the glass-paneled ICU doors, I told myself over and over to keep my eyes forward, to keep walking no matter what, because even though I had only been warned about the lights flickering 3 times, I had a gnawing, marrow-deep feeling that tonight something else was waiting there. Something that didn't care if I followed the rules or not. It happened so fast that for a moment I thought I had imagined it. A rapid series of flickers. 1, 2, 3. And then darkness swallowing the hall completely for the briefest of moments before the lights stuttered back to life. And instinct, pure and desperate, kicked in, forcing me to slam my eyes shut, spin around to face away from the glass, and start counting backward from 50 at a frantic, breathless pace, my voice trembling so badly it barely sounded human. And as I counted, I could hear something shifting behind the glass, a sound like wet fabric dragging across linoleum, a slow, deliberate slithering that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. 45, 44, 43. My mind raced, every instinct begging me to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there blind and exposed. But I forced myself to keep counting, because the rules were clear, and disobeying them would be worse than death. And then, between 40 and 39, I heard the soft, deliberate tap-tap-tap of something sharp rapping against the glass directly behind me. And even though every cell in my body shrieked at me to look, I squeezed my eyes tighter, nails digging into my palms so hard I broke the skin. When I finally reached 0, I waited, my breath coming in shallow, painful gasps, until the sound stopped, until the buzzing lights returned to a steady, pitiful hum. And only then did I dare to open my eyes and turn around. But the hallway was empty. Or at least, it looked empty at first, until I noticed the thin trail of dark, wet smears leading from the ICU doors across the floor and disappearing around the corner ahead. And my stomach twisted itself into a sick, writhing knot, because I knew with absolute certainty that whatever had been standing there, whatever had been tapping so gently, so mockingly against the glass, was not gone. It had just moved. I wanted to leave right then and there, to walk out into the cold night air and never look back. But my body betrayed me, my legs carrying me forward as if pulled by invisible strings. And as I rounded the corner, I heard it. The unmistakable, agonizing squeak of rusty wheels turning slowly behind me, and my heart plummeted into my stomach because I remembered the third rule. I remembered Karen's pale, tight-lipped warning about the gurney that moved on its own between midnight and dawn, and without thinking, without daring to glance behind me, I bolted for the nearest door. It was room 311, a small, empty patient room with a single, neatly made bed in the center, and I barely managed to wrench the door open and fling myself inside, slamming it shut behind me and diving under the bed just as the squeaking grew louder, closer, almost right outside the door, and I lay there in the suffocating darkness, my mouth pressed tightly shut against the dusty linoleum, every muscle in my body rigid with terror as the sound passed by, so close I could hear the soft scrape of something dragging its hand, or maybe its claws, along the wall as it moved. Minutes passed, maybe hours, until the hallway fell silent again, and still I did not move, too afraid that the moment I emerged, it would be waiting for me, crouched and grinning with too many teeth just outside my view. And it wasn't until I heard the faint, crackling buzz of the intercom that I finally dared to lift my head slightly, my ears straining to catch the announcement. And what came next almost made my heart stop. Code Black, all staff to sublevel 3, said the calm, unfamiliar voice over the speakers, smooth and cold and utterly devoid of anything human. And pure, primal fear flooded my veins as I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezed my eyes shut, and lay as still as a corpse beneath the bed, praying that I had been fast enough, that it hadn't noticed me. The intercom crackled again, louder this time, the voice repeating its command, and I could hear movement outside the room now, heavy, dragging footsteps shuffling down the hall, doors creaking open one by one, and somewhere far off, the faint, bone-chilling sound of someone, or something, calling my name in a sing-song whisper. And even though I pressed my hands harder against my ears until the skin felt ready to split, I could still hear it, could still feel it vibrating through the floor into my very bones. I don't know how long I lay there, muscles cramping, tears leaking from the corners of my tightly shut eyes, but eventually the voice faded, the footsteps receded, and silence returned, thick and suffocating. And only then did I dare to crawl out from under the bed, my legs trembling so badly I could barely stand, and I stumbled back into the hallway, my mind a fog of terror and exhaustion. The hospital was different now, darker, quieter, almost wrong, as if I had stepped into a version of it that existed just slightly out of sync with reality. And even though every instinct screamed at me to find Karen, to find Nurse David, to find someone who could tell me what the hell was happening, the halls were empty, the nurses' station abandoned, the only sounds, the distant, whispering echoes of voices I couldn't quite understand. It wasn't until I turned a corner and saw the black feather lying in the middle of the floor, stark, glossy, and impossible to miss against the otherwise spotless linoleum, that I remembered the fifth rule and the matchbook Karen had pressed into my hand, and with my heart hammering in my chest, I forced myself to bend down, snatch up the feather without saying a word, and half run, half stumble toward the utility room down the hall. I fumbled with the matchbook, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it, but somehow, by some miracle, I managed to strike a match, the tiny flame flaring to life with a hiss, and I tossed the feather into the incinerator chute and fed the flame into it, watching as the blackened edges curled and burned away into nothing. And for just a moment, just the briefest breath of time, the oppressive, crushing sense of wrongness around me seemed to lift. But only just. Because even as I stood there, panting, staring into the incinerator, I heard it. The soft, almost imperceptible sound of something breathing behind me, so close that I could feel the warmth of it against the back of my neck. And when I turned around, I was no longer alone. Standing there, bathed in the low, hellish glow of the incinerator's mouth, was a figure so grotesquely wrong that for a heartbeat, my mind simply refused to understand what my eyes were seeing, as if my brain was desperately trying to protect me from the image before it could fully register. But the longer I stared, frozen with a terror so deep it made my bones ache, the clearer it became that whatever had crept up behind me was not, and had never been, human. Even though it wore the pale, drooping mask of a woman's face. A face that seemed half melted, the features sliding downward like wax on a candle, her eyes too wide, too glassy, and filled with a bottomless, howling grief that didn't match the sickly smile stretching her ruined lips upward into a grin so forced it looked like the skin might tear. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to do anything but stand there stupidly staring into the abyss of that face. But it was as if my body no longer belonged to me, as if my muscles had been filled with wet cement. And when the thing leaned closer, so close that the stringy clumps of its hair brushed against my cheek, it whispered, in a voice that was somehow both gurgling wet and dry as crackling paper. "You forgot one." And the instant the words hit my ear, every light in the room, every flickering bulb, every humming panel overhead went out at once, plunging the world into a black so complete that it swallowed even the memory of sight. I don't remember moving, but somehow I stumbled backward, the incinerator's last flicker of flame burning into my retinas as the only point of reference I had left. And I turned and ran. I ran without looking where I was going. I ran like an animal, arms flailing blindly, crashing into walls and carts and doors, the sound of that wet, dragging breathing never more than a hair's breadth behind me, closer with every gasping step, until I burst through the swinging doors of the main hallway and slammed them shut behind me with a strength I didn't know I had, the impact rattling my teeth and making the glass panels groan. For a few moments, there was nothing but my own ragged breathing and the slick, cold sweat pouring down my back. But then, like a nightmare repeating itself, the lights in the hallway flickered once, twice, and then 3 rapid times in succession. And even in my panicked state, some buried, instinctive part of me remembered the second rule, the one I had drilled into myself night after night, but never truly believed I would need. So without thinking, I spun around so that my back was to the ICU windows, clamped my hands over my eyes, and began counting backward from 50 as loud and steady as I could, my voice shaking so violently it barely resembled my own. 50, 49, 48. I stammered, feeling the tremor of movement, a weight pressing against the other side of the glass, a distortion of air so heavy it felt like gravity itself was buckling. And I had to fight every suicidal instinct in my body that screamed to turn, to look, to see what was there. But I squeezed my eyes tighter and forced myself to keep counting, even when the sound of fingernails, or something far worse, began tapping against the glass in an arrhythmic, mocking pattern. By the time I reached 1, the tapping had stopped, but I didn't move immediately, didn't dare, because somehow, some way, I knew that even the slightest hesitation, even the briefest curiosity, would be enough for whatever was waiting to pull me through the window and into a place from which no one returned. So I stayed there, hands clamped to my face, heart hammering a deafening rhythm in my chest, until the corridor's lights buzzed and steadied into their normal, sickly yellow glow. Finally, when it felt like I couldn't stand another second of it, I cracked open my fingers just enough to peek through, and seeing nothing waiting for me, nothing moving in the hall, I lowered my hands and staggered backward, only to nearly collide with Janice, one of the senior nurses, her uniform rumpled and her face bloodless, her eyes darting around wildly as if she expected something to leap out of the walls at any moment. "Did you hear it too?" Janice whispered, clutching my arm so tightly that her fingernails bit into my skin, and when I nodded, still too breathless to speak, she leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a shaking hiss. "You have to come with me, now. They're doing it again. Code Black." I didn't understand at first, didn't want to understand, but even as she dragged me down the corridor, even as the walls seemed to pulse and flex around us like a living thing, the overhead intercom crackled to life. And in that horrible, calm, unfamiliar voice, it announced, "Code Black, all staff to sublevel 3. And the sound of it seemed to worm its way straight into my skull, each word coated in honey and venom, each syllable heavier than the last. Janice didn't hesitate. She dropped to the floor, hands over her ears, eyes squeezed shut, and screamed, "Down now!" And for one agonizing second, I froze, the lizard part of my brain arguing that maybe, just maybe, I could make it to the stairwell. Maybe I could escape. But then the voice on the intercom said my name, my real name, the one almost no one at the hospital even knew. And that was enough to shatter every last piece of defiance I had left. I slammed my hands over my ears so hard that my palms ached, squeezed my eyes shut so tightly that sparks of color danced behind my lids, and dropped to the filthy floor beside Janice, trying not to move, not to breathe, not to even exist, while the voice coiled through the air above us like a living thing, whispering promises of escape, of safety, of anything I might have secretly wanted. And when none of that worked, it began to plead, and when pleading failed, it began to curse, and when cursing failed, it began to scream. It screamed until the very air felt like it was splitting apart, until blood trickled from my nose and ears, until I thought my skull might actually burst from the pressure. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the voice cut out, leaving a silence so dense and absolute that it felt like the world had been hollowed out. I didn't dare move until Janice did, didn't even breathe until I felt her hand, shaking and bloodied, tap my shoulder. And when I finally opened my eyes, the world seemed blurry and unreal, the fluorescent lights above flickering in and out as if struggling to stay anchored to reality. Janice hauled herself upright, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, and rasped, "You're not safe anymore. It knows you now. You have to follow the rules perfectly from now on. Perfectly. Or next time. It'll take more than your name." I nodded, too numb to do anything else, too aware of the sticky warmth running down the sides of my face. And as we staggered toward the emergency exit, the low, rattling sound of wheels on tile, a sound I knew all too well, began to echo from the far end of the hallway. And when Janice heard it, she went rigid, her face draining of what little color remained. "The gurney," Janice whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing squeal of rusted metal, and her eyes locked onto mine with a wild, desperate fear. "Don't look back. Don't you dare. Find a room. Hide now." And as the squeaking grew louder, as something unseen and unthinkable came rolling inexorably toward us through the endless, rotting bowels of the hospital, I knew that if I even so much as glanced over my shoulder, everything I had endured, everything I had survived, would have been for nothing. And so I ran. And this time, I didn't dare look back. I ran blindly through the dim, pulsing corridors, the decaying fluorescent lights overhead flickering in and out of existence like dying fireflies, my breath tearing raggedly from my lungs in great shuddering gasps, my heart hammering so loudly in my ears that it drowned out almost everything except the screeching, unbearable wail of those rusted gurney wheels gaining on us. And though every primal instinct screamed at me to risk a glance back to know just how close death had come, I forced my eyes forward, searching desperately for any open door, any darkened room that might offer even a sliver of protection from whatever horror was barreling down upon us with relentless, hungry momentum. Janice grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her nails digging painfully into my skin as she yanked me toward a narrow doorway that I hadn't even seen in my panic. And without thinking, without even slowing, we stumbled through it together, slamming the door behind us just as the deafening squeal of the gurney wheels skidded to a halt somewhere just outside. The sudden silence that followed so thick and unnatural that it pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight, making the tiny, windowless room we had found ourselves in feel less like a refuge and more like a coffin. Janice hissed under her breath, pulling me down roughly onto the filthy, dust-caked floor and pushing me hard under the bed, her face close enough to mine that I could see the wild terror in her wide, glistening eyes, even in the gloom. And as we both slid into the narrow, claustrophobic space beneath the bed frame, the silence outside shattered with a slow, deliberate creak, the unmistakable sound of the door handle turning as something that was not human began to push its way inside. I clamped a trembling hand over my mouth, squeezing my eyes shut so tightly that stars burst behind my eyelids, every muscle in my body locking rigid with fear as I heard the soft, almost playful squeal of the gurney wheels resuming once more, but this time moving slowly, almost lazily, back and forth across the room, as if the thing pushing it was savoring the moment, drawing it out, searching, hunting. Janice's hand found mine in the dark, her fingers crushing mine in a grip so tight it bordered on painful, and I could feel her silent plea, her desperate prayer that I would not move, not breathe, not do anything to draw the attention of whatever nightmare was now sharing the same stagnant, foul air with us. Because if we did, if we so much as shifted the wrong way or dared to open our eyes and look, we both knew we would never leave this room alive. Minutes passed, or hours, it was impossible to tell. Each second dragging out like an eternity as the gurney squeaked and bumped aimlessly around the room, sometimes stopping so close to where we hid that I could smell the sour, rotting stench of something ancient and wrong hovering just inches above the floor. And every time it paused, every time the wheels locked and something heavy and wet seemed to thud softly to the ground, I fought the near-overwhelming urge to scream. Then, without warning, the squeaking stopped entirely, replaced by a new sound, a soft, slithering scrape like long, brittle fingernails dragging themselves across the tile, slow and deliberate, moving closer and closer to the bed where we lay frozen in terror. And when the sound reached the very edge of the mattress above us, I felt something, some nameless, formless horror, lean down so low that the thin metal slats of the bed frame above us groaned under its weight. A voice, so broken and wet and wrong that it barely resembled anything human, gurgled from just beyond the mattress, whispering in a tone that made bile rise in my throat. "I know you're there. I can smell you." Janice's nails bit deeper into my hand, and I could feel her entire body trembling violently beside me. But she didn't make a sound, didn't so much as exhale, and I mimicked her stillness with every ounce of willpower I had left, even as tears streamed down my face and my body screamed to run, to fight, to do anything other than lie there and wait to die. Another eternity passed, each second stretching unbearably until, mercifully, the thing above us began to retreat, the bed frame groaning in protest as its unnatural weight lifted, the wet dragging sound fading gradually back toward the door, accompanied once more by the eerie squeal of the gurney wheels, growing softer and softer until, finally, the faint click of the door closing signaled that whatever had entered the room was, for now, gone. We lay there for a long time afterward, too terrified to move, until finally, Janice stirred, releasing my hand and crawling slowly out from under the bed, her movements stiff and mechanical, like someone moving through a nightmare they hadn't yet fully escaped. And when she finally pulled herself upright and offered me a hand, her voice was barely more than a hoarse rasp as she said, "We can't stay here. It'll come back." I scrambled out from under the bed, every joint in my body aching from the strain of staying so rigid for so long, and together we crept toward the door, listening intently for any sign of the thing still lurking beyond. But all we heard was the faint hum of the dying lights and the distant ghostly echo of wind howling through broken windows somewhere deep within the bowels of the hospital. Janice cracked the door open an inch and peered out, her face illuminated briefly by the flickering hallway lights, and when she nodded sharply, I followed her out, my every step measured and silent, my nerves stretched so tight that I thought for sure I would snap at any moment. The hallway beyond was empty, at least for now, but the air felt wrong, heavier than before, saturated with the kind of deep, oppressive malevolence that seemed to ooze from the very walls. And as we hurried along the corridor, sticking close to the shadows, I realized that the hospital itself was changing, warping into something even more nightmarish than it had been before. The familiar pathways twisting into unfamiliar mazes, the doors to rooms we had passed 100 times before now bearing strange, indecipherable symbols scratched deep into the wood. At one point, as we rounded a corner, the intercom crackled to life overhead, a shrill burst of static that made us both flinch, and then, chillingly, the calm, unfamiliar voice announced, "Code Black, all staff to Sublevel 3. My blood turned to ice. Without hesitation, Janice clapped her hands over her ears, shutting her eyes tightly, and screamed at me, "Now! Cover your ears, close your eyes, don't move, no matter what you hear." I obeyed instantly, my palms pressing hard against the sides of my head, my eyes squeezed shut, and I stood there, trembling, utterly still, as the voice continued to drone overhead, its tone sickeningly sweet, almost coaxing, like something trying to lure a child into the dark. Seconds stretched into agonizing minutes, and just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, just when my muscles were beginning to quiver uncontrollably from the strain of staying so still, I heard it, my name, whispered so softly, so lovingly, that for a split second, some deep, traitorous part of me wanted to answer it. But I didn't. I stayed frozen, tears leaking from my closed eyes, my hands clamped like a vice over my ears, until at last the intercom went dead, plunging the corridor back into eerie, suffocating silence. Only then did I dare to open my eyes again. And when I did, I saw that Janice was staring at me with an expression of pure horror, her mouth working silently like she was trying to form words but couldn't. And slowly, with mounting dread, I turned to follow her gaze. And that's when I saw it, standing less than 10 feet away, watching us, waiting. It stood there in the dim, shuddering light, impossibly tall and impossibly still. A shadow made flesh, its body rippling and twitching subtly as though barely containing something far worse beneath the stretched, grayish skin. And although I could not make out its face, and thank God for that, I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing down on my chest, squeezing my lungs tight until each breath came in ragged gasps. And when Janice finally found her voice, she didn't scream or shout, she simply hissed in a raw, broken whisper. "Don't move, don't even blink. It's testing us." And I knew, somehow, that if I so much as flinched, that thing would surge forward faster than thought and tear us apart where we stood. The thing began to sway, its joints bending and cracking in ways that no human body ever could, a slow, hypnotic rhythm that seemed to worm its way into my brain. And even though every instinct in me screamed to run, I couldn't force my legs to move, couldn't even look away, locked there in a silent standoff with a nightmare made real, until, mercifully, Janice, still keeping her voice barely above a breath, said, "On my count, we're gonna move, real slow, toward the stairwell. Just keep facing it. Do not, under any circumstances, turn your back." And every word she spoke felt like a fragile thread stretched taut between us and death. She started to count. 1, 2, 3. And on 3, we took the first agonizing step backward, never looking away. And the creature's body twitched violently at our movement, a grotesque spasm that made a wet, popping sound in the silent hall. But somehow, miraculously, it didn't attack, only watched with that suffocating, endless attention that made every second feel like hours stretched on the rack. And we continued our slow, stumbling retreat, step by painful step, until my heel bumped against something hard, and I realized with a shudder of relief that we had reached the swinging metal door to the stairwell. Janice, her hand shaking so badly I thought she might drop it, reached behind her and fumbled for the push bar. And the second the latch clicked open, the thing shrieked, a piercing, inhuman sound that felt like needles stabbing into my ears. And its entire body convulsed forward in a blur of impossible motion. But we were already tumbling backward through the door, slamming it shut just as its black, clawed fingers scraped furrows into the heavy metal with a nails-on-chalkboard screech that left my bones vibrating in pain. We didn't wait to see if it would follow. We just ran, half falling, half sliding down the grimy, twisting stairwell, the overhead lights flickering madly in our wake, casting long, broken shadows that seemed to reach for us as we fled downward into the bowels of the hospital. And somewhere above us, The heavy door shuddered under repeated brutal impacts, the metal groaning in protest, but, for now, holding firm. We stumbled onto the landing for the third floor when Janice suddenly grabbed my sleeve, yanking me hard enough to nearly send me sprawling, and pointed at the door labeled morgue, her eyes wide with desperate urgency. And though every fiber of my being rebelled against the idea of willingly going into such a place, I understood, or at least I thought I did, that whatever was behind us was worse than anything that could possibly be waiting inside. The morgue was a cavernous, refrigerated expanse of metal and tile, the air inside so cold it burned in my lungs, and the rows of closed body drawers seemed to loom in the half-light like silent sentinels. And as Janice kicked the door closed behind us and threw the heavy locking bolt into place, I realized that the silence inside was not ordinary silence. It was the deep, oppressive quiet of something holding its breath, waiting. "We have to hide," Janice said, her voice cracking from fear and exhaustion, and she pointed to one of the larger storage lockers at the far end of the room, one with enough space for a person to crawl inside. And even though the very idea of trapping myself in such a place made me want to scream, I nodded, because the pounding at the stairwell door was getting louder, and it was only a matter of time before it gave way. We hurried across the room, the tiles slick and treacherous underfoot, and as I pulled the heavy drawer out, the cold air poured out in a gust that smelled faintly of antiseptic, and something far worse, something sweet and rotting. But I pushed the thought away, climbing inside and curling up as small as I could, Janice squeezing in after me, pulling the drawer shut with a muffled clang that seemed far too loud in the otherwise suffocating stillness. It was pitch dark inside, the only sounds the ragged rasp of our breathing and the slow, rhythmic pounding of my heart against my ribs. And as we lay there, every muscle in my body cramping with the effort to stay perfectly still, I heard it. The heavy morgue door creaking open, slow and deliberate, followed by the soft, wet sound of bare feet slapping against the tile floor. And I felt Janice's fingers dig into my arm with bruising force. Thing moved slowly, methodically, pausing every few feet to sniff the air with long, rattling inhalations that seemed to drag directly at my soul. And as it came closer, I had to clamp my hand over my mouth to stifle a whimper of terror, because I could hear it now, a low, crooning sound, almost like a lullaby, sung in a voice that was horribly, heartbreakingly familiar. It was my mother's voice. "Come out," it sang, soft and sweet. "Come out, sweetheart. It's safe now." And for one hideous moment, my body betrayed me, twitching with the almost irresistible urge to obey. But Janice, bless her, damn her, dug her nails into my arm, hard enough to draw blood, grounding me back in the agony of reality. The footsteps passed our drawer by, circling once, twice, before finally stopping directly in front of us. And I could feel, somehow, without seeing, that it was bending down, pressing its grotesque, stolen face close to the thin metal barrier that separated us from oblivion. The crooning stopped. The silence stretched out until I thought I would go mad from the weight of it. Then, so close that I felt its breath chilling my skin even through the drawer, it whispered, in my mother's broken, weeping voice, "I found you." For one heart-shattering moment after the words left its stolen lips, I was certain that the flimsy metal drawer would be ripped open, and I would be dragged out into the cold, sterile nightmare of the morgue to face whatever unspeakable horror waited for me beyond the darkness. But instead, the thing only lingered there, so close that I could feel the metal vibrating with its breath, with its hunger, with a patient, calculated malice that suggested it had all the time in the world to wait for me to make a single fatal mistake. And just when the pressure became unbearable, just when I thought my lungs might burst from the effort of holding in every shuddering, terrified breath, I heard it. The sharp, sudden scrape of something hard against the tile floor, and then another and another, until the sound filled the room like a cacophony of skeletal fingers scratching to get in. Janice, her hand trembling uncontrollably against mine, squeezed twice, a silent, desperate warning. And although I didn't understand at first, it clicked when I heard the faint, almost inaudible flutter of wings above us, the telltale whisper of feathers brushing against the ceiling vents, and my heart sank into my stomach, because I knew then we had missed one, a black feather, somewhere along the way. And now, as per the fifth rule, they were multiplying. The whispers began softly at first, just the faintest suggestion of voices slithering through the frigid air, but they grew louder, more insistent, and worse. They spoke not in gibberish or unknown tongues, but in perfect, venomous clarity, each whisper twisting itself into the most secret fears festering in the darkest corners of my mind, fears I had never dared voice aloud. Fears of abandonment, fears of dying alone, fears that every loved one I had ever trusted had only ever pretended to care. And the more I tried to block them out, the sharper and clearer they became, gnawing at my sanity with relentless, jagged teeth. Somewhere in the chaos of those whispers and scrapes and the sickly sweet lullabies, the creature straightened, its shadow falling away from the drawer at last. And I dared to hope, foolishly, pathetically, that it might leave, that it might decide we weren't worth the trouble after all. But that hope was dashed the instant the overhead lights flickered violently 3 times in rapid succession, a strobing, disorienting signal that froze the blood in my veins. Because the second rule was clear. If the ICU lights flickered 3 times, you must not look at the windows. But we weren't in the ICU anymore. We were trapped inside the morgue. And there were windows here, too. Janice's breath hitched audibly beside me as the realization slammed into us both at the same moment. And without a word, she squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face against my shoulder. And I followed suit. My own eyelids clamped shut so tightly that I saw bursts of red and black dancing behind them, and I began to count backwards from 50 aloud. My voice cracking and wavering with every number, desperate to drown out the whispers, the crooning, the scratching, desperate to fulfill the ritual and protect what little sliver of life we still clung to. 50, 49, 48. I choked out, my voice barely more than a rasp, and somewhere in the swirling madness of sound and cold, I heard the distinct wet slap of bare feet approaching again, slow and deliberate, accompanied now by the dry, papery flutter of countless wings scraping along the ceiling and walls. And I kept counting, faster now, almost tripping over the numbers in my terror, because I could feel it getting closer, could feel its presence swelling in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. 47, 46, 45. I gasped, squeezing my eyes even tighter, nails digging into my own palms as I clung to the ritual with everything I had left. Because I knew with the certainty of a condemned man, that if I opened my eyes now, even for a split second, it would be over, and there would be no coming back. Janice began to count along with me, her voice strained and panicked but steady enough to keep me anchored, and somehow, we made it all the way down to 1, our final, desperate, breathless plea to whatever unseen forces might still be willing to spare us. And when we hit that last number, the room fell deathly silent once again, so sudden and complete that the absence of sound felt almost as terrifying as the chaos had been. I didn't dare move. Neither did Janice. For what felt like an eternity, we lay there, shivering violently in the freezing darkness, waiting, praying, listening for any hint that it was gone. But then, just when I thought we might be safe, the drawer above ours creaked open with a slow, metallic groan, followed by the soft, wet thud of something heavy sliding out and landing on the floor. Janice, her voice so faint I almost missed it, whispered against my ear, "It's still here. It's waiting for us to move. It's trying to trick us." I nodded ever so slightly, not daring to make a sound, but my body was reaching its limits. The freezing air, the cramped, suffocating space, the cacophony of whispers gnawing away at the edges of my mind. It was all becoming too much, and I knew that if we didn't find a way out soon, we would die here, not from claws or fangs or curses, but simply from exhaustion and terror. Then, without warning, the morgue door slammed open so hard it cracked against the tiled wall, and a figure stumbled inside. A man, his white lab coat soaked with blood, his face twisted in terror, and he was screaming, "Run! Run! It's coming! It's coming!" over and over again, his voice cracking into high animalistic wails. And although I didn't recognize him, the thing that followed close behind him needed no introduction. It was the gurney. The cursed gurney with its rusted-out, screeching wheels, and the shrouded form slumped atop it, its sheet slick with dark, glistening stains, moving of its own accord with a dreadful, inexorable purpose. The man tried to run, tried to scramble back toward the door, but the gurney caught him, its wheels screeching as it turned with impossible speed. And before he could even scream again, the sheet peeled back to reveal not a corpse, but dozens, no, hundreds, of thin, glistening black hands that shot out and wrapped around his legs, his arms, his throat, dragging him down, screaming into the gurney's cold, hungry embrace. Janice clapped her hand over my mouth to muffle the sob that threatened to burst out of me as the man's final gurgling scream was swallowed whole by the writhing mass of hands. And then the gurney, sated for now, began to turn, its wheels shrieking against the tile as it scanned the room for its next victim. Us. The gurney's wheels screamed in protest as it pivoted sharply, the rusted metal scraping in sharp, angry bursts against the linoleum floor. And as the shrouded form atop it heaved and twisted, the black hands slick with blood and something far worse still twitching and groping hungrily. Janice grabbed my wrist with a grip so tight I thought the bones would snap, yanking me backward into the deeper shadow beneath the table, just as the gurney lurched forward with terrifying speed, the shrieking sound of it rolling closer and closer, drilling into my skull until it felt like my mind would split apart from the pressure alone. And though every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to flee, to do anything other than stay frozen beneath that cold, sterile slab of metal, I knew, we both knew, that movement was death. So we pressed ourselves flat, bodies trembling violently, our breaths rasping in shallow gasps against the hollow dark, as the gurney passed inches from our hiding spot, the reek of old blood and decay washing over us like a living thing, wrapping around us and suffocating us in its putrid embrace. I bit down so hard on my tongue that I tasted blood, anything to stop the keening wail rising in my throat. And Janice, dear God, Janice! I could feel her heart hammering against my side, fast and frantic, the rapid, helpless beat of a trapped animal. And when the gurney paused again, the wheels spinning in slow, grinding circles, I thought for certain it had sensed us, had smelled the sheer, rancid fear pouring off our skin like sweat. And I squeezed my eyes shut tighter, praying to any god that would listen that we would not end up like that man, swallowed whole by a mass of writhing, grasping things that wore human hands like sick puppets. Seconds stretched into centuries, the tension so thick it felt like I could chew it. And then, with a final shuddering squeal, the gurney rolled onward, the mass beneath its sheet heaving in wet, sloshing jerks as it disappeared down the hallway, leaving behind a trail of something black and oily that gleamed under the flickering fluorescent lights like a trail of venom. And it was only once the last echoes of its wheels had died away that Janice dared to move, her hands trembling violently as she tugged at my sleeve, mouthing, though her voice barely rose above a breath, "We have to move, now." Crawling from beneath the table felt like emerging from a grave, every nerve screaming in protest. But the air outside was no safer, thick with the metallic tang of blood and something older, fouler, like the rotting breath of a tomb long sealed away from the world. And I stumbled after Janice as she crept low along the wall, our footsteps muffled by our terror, as we headed toward the only hope we had left. The stairwell at the far end of the corridor that led back up to the staff floors, away from the horrors that lurked below. We had barely made it halfway when the overhead speakers crackled to life with a sharp, grating burst of static that froze us both mid-step. And in that endless, awful moment, the voice, calm, measured, almost gentle, flowed over the intercom, sending a shudder of pure, blinding terror down my spine, as it said, "Code Black. All staff to Sub-Level 3. Code Black. All staff to Sub-Level 3. And Janice gasped, a strangled, whimpering sound, because we knew what that meant. Knew that if we so much as twitched, if we so much as breathed too loudly, the thing that controlled the voice would notice us, and then it would call our names. Janice dropped to her knees instantly, pressing both hands over her ears so tightly her knuckles turned white. And I did the same, squeezing my eyes shut until stars danced behind my eyelids, fighting the nearly overwhelming urge to scream as the voice continued to drone, each repetition worming its way deeper into my skull until it felt like it was speaking directly into my brain, bypassing flesh and bone entirely. And though I wanted to run, to flee, to do anything other than sit there helplessly on the cold floor, I knew that movement meant death. No, worse than death. And so I forced myself to stay still, muscles locked, heart thundering so loudly I was sure it must somehow be audible to whatever foul thing was listening. The announcement finally ended, the last echoes of the voice lingering in the crackling static like foul smoke. But we stayed frozen for long, agonizing minutes afterward, terrified that any movement, any sign of life would bring the voice, or what lay behind it, down upon us. And it was only when the oppressive weight of the air seemed to ease, only when the lights stopped flickering and the shadows along the walls ceased their twitching, restless dance, that Janice slowly, carefully, pulled her hands away from her ears and whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear her, "We have to burn the feather." It made no sense at first, her words jarring in their randomness. But when I followed her gaze down the hallway, my stomach dropped into my shoes, because there, lying in the dead center of the now perfectly silent, perfectly still corridor, was a single black feather, so dark it seemed to absorb the dim light around it. And already, as I stared, I saw a second feather drift lazily down from nowhere to land beside it. And then a third and a fourth, each one appearing without warning, like malignant snowflakes heralding an oncoming storm. Janice didn't wait. She grabbed my hand and hauled me upright with strength I didn't know she possessed, whispering urgently, come on, utility rooms this way." And I stumbled after her, trying not to look at the walls, trying not to see the shadows that had begun to slither and writhe along the ceiling, their elongated limbs reaching out with obscene eagerness, whispering things I couldn't quite hear, but which made my soul recoil in instinctive horror. The utility room was just ahead, the heavy steel door hanging slightly ajar, and Janice shoved it open with her shoulder, dragging me inside before slamming it shut behind us with a force that rattled the frame, plunging us into darkness, broken only by the faint, sputtering glow of a single overhead bulb. And there, against the far wall, loomed the incinerator, its maw hanging open like the gaping mouth of some great slumbering beast. "Quick," Janice hissed, fumbling at her pocket for the lighter she always kept on her keychain. And I, not trusting myself to speak, dropped to my knees, scooping up the handful of feathers that had somehow already followed us into the room, each one icy cold and feather-light, yet somehow feeling heavier than the very air we breathed. Janice flicked the lighter to life with trembling fingers, the tiny flame casting wild, leaping shadows across the walls, and together, we fed the feathers one by one into the incinerator's gaping mouth, the fire catching with a whoosh that sent a blast of scorching heat across my face. And as the feathers burned, the shadows along the walls shrieked in rage, a high, keening sound that set my teeth on edge and made my vision blur with tears. We burned every last feather, not daring to leave even a single one, and only when the last ember died did the screaming stop, the shadows melting away into the walls like retreating waves, leaving behind a silence so deep and so absolute that it felt almost as terrifying as the noise had been. Panting, drenched in sweat, and shaking from head to toe, Janice turned to me, her face pale and wild-eyed, and said, voice raw and broken, "We have to get out of here. Now." And from somewhere deep within the building, so faint it might have been a trick of my shattered mind, I heard it. A soft, familiar weeping, drifting from the direction of room 209. The moment that pitiful, gut-wrenching weeping brushed against my ears, I felt my entire body stiffen, as if invisible hands had seized me by the spine and locked every muscle in place, because no matter how faint or far away it sounded, no matter how desperately my mind tried to rationalize it as just another echo or leftover hallucination from the horrors we had barely survived, I knew with a soul-deep certainty that it was real, that it was coming from room 209, and that it was meant for me. Janice grabbed my wrist with a strength that belied her trembling form and hissed, "Move, now, before it notices us." And somehow, despite the terror freezing the blood in my veins, I forced my legs to respond, stumbling after her down the dim corridor, the overhead lights buzzing weakly and casting sickly pools of yellow that seemed to shrink with every step we took, as if the darkness itself were reaching out to choke the life from them. The weeping grew louder, rising and falling in heart-wrenching waves, and even though my rational mind screamed at me not to, some primal part of me couldn't stop imagining the source of those sobs, picturing a small, broken figure curled up against the door of room 209, its shoulders heaving, its voice laced with a pleading so raw that it shredded the edges of my sanity, just to hear it. And when Janice yanked me around a corner toward the service elevator, I dared to glance over my shoulder. Just a flicker of movement, and my heart nearly exploded in my chest when I saw the door to room 209, a door that had been firmly shut moments before, now standing slightly ajar, a thin sliver of pure blackness yawning within. "Don't look," Janice snapped, her voice a strangled whisper, and I jerked my head forward again, my palms slick with sweat, my stomach rolling violently as we reached the elevator, and Janice stabbed the call button again and again with frantic shaking jabs of her finger, each mechanical ding of the descending car echoing through the empty halls like the toll of a funeral bell. Behind us, the soft weeping shifted, warping into something more deliberate, more pointed. A low, keening call that sounded exactly like my mother's voice. And it said my name, once, in a way that left me cold all the way to my marrow, and I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut as hard as I could, whispering, "It's not her? It's not her? It's not her." While Janice, tears streaming down her face, kept hammering the elevator button like it was a life raft in a rising flood. At last, the elevator doors slid open with a mechanical sigh that might as well have been the gasp of some great beast, and without thinking, we lunged inside, slamming the closed door button so hard that the panel cracked beneath our fists. And just as the doors began to creep shut, a hand, no, not a hand, something that only resembled a hand, slid into the narrowing gap, its skin sickly pale and stretched too tightly over knobby bones, the fingers too long, too many joints bending in the wrong directions, the nails black and split and oozing dark liquid as it scrabbled madly at the edges. Janice screamed, a raw animal sound, and kicked at the hand with all the strength she had left. And whether by some miracle or by sheer blind luck, the doors managed to close completely, severing the thing with a sickening crunch that sent a spatter of black ichor across the brushed steel walls, the elevator jerking into motion with a lurch that almost knocked us both off our feet. We collapsed against the back wall, gasping for air, and for one terrible moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound the soft whir of the elevator rising floor by agonizing floor. And then, just as I thought I might finally catch my breath, the intercom system above our heads crackled to life with a high-pitched screech that sent a fresh spike of terror through my skull. And a calm, unfamiliar voice said, in that same pleasant, casual tone I had heard whispered about, but never truly believed until now. "Code Black, all staff to Sublevel 3. The moment those words hit the air, Janice and I locked eyes, our expressions mirror images of pure, undiluted horror. And with no time to think, no time to even breathe, we both slapped our hands over our ears, squeezed our eyes shut, and pressed ourselves flat against the cold elevator walls, and doing everything we could to remain absolutely still. As the voice continued to drone, sweet and soft and coaxing, its cadence growing more and more intimate with every word. Through the barrier of my hands, I could still hear it faintly, a serpent's whisper curling against my brain, promising safety, promising answers, promising that all I had to do was listen. And worse, I heard my name, clear and precise, spoken with an affection so sincere it made bile rise in my throat, because I knew, deep in my gut, that if I so much as twitched, if I even twitched, it would find me, and I would be lost forever. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had no meaning anymore. Before the voice finally faded into static and then blessed silence, and only then, only when I was sure it was truly gone, did I dare to crack open one eye, finding Janice staring back at me, her face wet with tears and shining with terror, nodding once to tell me it was safe. The elevator chimed and jolted to a stop, and the doors slid open to reveal a corridor bathed in flickering red emergency lights, the air heavy and oppressive, every shadow seeming to pulse and breathe like a living thing. And without a word, Janice and I stumbled out, our limbs sluggish and uncooperative, every instinct screaming at us that we had left one nightmare only to enter another. Somewhere far ahead, down the endless twisting hallways, there was a sound so quiet I almost missed it. The slow, rhythmic squeak of rusted wheels turning, drawing closer with every heartbeat. Janice grabbed my arm, nails digging deep into my skin, and whispered, her voice trembling so violently it was barely audible. "The gurney. It's coming back." And deep within the building, from somewhere close, so close I heard the softest whisper. My mother's voice, broken and pleading, calling my name again. We had survived so much, but now it felt like the real horror was only just beginning. The slow, rhythmic squeak of those rusted wheels grew louder, closer, almost deliberate in its approach, like whatever unseen force guided it was savoring the inevitability of what was about to happen. And every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, to hide, to do anything except stay frozen in that red-lit hallway where the walls seemed to breathe and pulse with malevolent life. But terror had rooted me to the floor until Janice, voice sharp and cracking with panic, barked, "Move, damn it! Move now!" and yanked me bodily toward the nearest door without waiting for a response. We stumbled into an abandoned patient room, the door hanging loose on its hinges and the fluorescent lights inside flickering with a sickly stutter. And as soon as we crossed the threshold, Janice slammed the door shut as best she could and dragged me toward the bed. Both of us dropping to our knees and scrambling underneath it, the cracked vinyl mattress sagging dangerously low over our heads, our breathing loud and ragged in the suffocating darkness as we listened to the gurney squeal and clatter down the hallway, drawing closer, closer, until the sound seemed to fill every inch of the building like a living, breathing thing. I pressed my forehead against the cold, sticky tile floor and clenched my fists so tightly, my nails dug bloody crescents into my palms. Because I knew the rules. We both knew the rules. And if we dared to so much as glance at what was pushing that gurney, if we let our curiosity outweigh our fear even for a single heartbeat, we were already dead. And worse, our deaths wouldn't be quick or clean. They would be slow, agonizing, and filled with horrors no sane mind could endure. The wheels stopped just outside the door, the silence that followed heavier than any scream. And from my position under the bed, I could hear something breathing, something wet and rattling like lungs filled with fluid and rot. And then came the scraping sound of fingernails, long and splintered, dragging slowly across the metal doorframe as whatever was out there traced its way inside, step by agonizing step. Beside me, Janice was trembling so hard that the entire bedframe vibrated, and I reached out blindly, finding her hand and squeezing it with all the strength I had left, willing her to stay still, to stay silent, because I knew with every cell of my being that if we made even the smallest sound, even the tiniest gasp, it would know exactly where we were, and then it would be over. The thing moved into the room, its steps uneven and dragging, and through the tiny slit between the floor and the mattress, I caught a glimpse of its legs. Bloated, purpled flesh barely contained by a stained hospital gown, thick, black veins bulging under the skin like worms, and feet that left wet, sludgy prints wherever they touched the floor, as if whatever cursed thing animated them was leaking out with every step. It paused at the foot of the bed, so close that I could smell it. A stench like rotting meat left to fester in the summer sun, thick and greasy and clinging to the inside of my nostrils. And for one heart-stopping moment, I thought it would crouch down, peer under the bed, and find us huddled there like cornered animals. But instead, it moved on, the gurney wheels squealing once more, as it slowly, painstakingly made its way across the room and out into the hallway again. And only when the sound had faded to a distant echo did I dare to release the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My vision swimming with black spots as oxygen rushed back to my starved brain. Janice crawled out first, moving on hands and knees like a wounded animal, and I followed, both of us rising unsteadily to our feet. And without a word, we staggered back into the hallway, the flickering red lights above us casting long, stuttering shadows that made it impossible to tell what was real and what was just the fever dream of terror-addled minds. Ahead of us, the corridor seemed to stretch and warp, doors on either side yawning open into yawning black mouths, and somewhere, impossibly close, I heard the intercom crackle again, that same calm, detached voice slicing through the static to announce, "Code Black, all staff to sublevel 3. And even though we had just endured it, even though every fiber of my soul screamed at me to obey, to freeze, to cover my ears and shut my eyes, Janice grabbed my face between her hands, forcing me to look at her, and whispered, voice low and fierce, "No, not this time. We have to move. We have to get out now." I nodded, unable to speak, and together we ran, stumbling and weaving like drunkards, the world tilting crazily around us as the walls groaned and shuddered, the floor buckling beneath our feet like the hospital itself was rejecting us, spitting us out like poison. We burst through a set of fire doors into the stairwell, the heavy metal slamming shut behind us with a booming clang that echoed up and down the concrete shaft, and without hesitation, we began to climb, legs burning, lungs searing with every breath, the dim emergency lights overhead blinking in and out of existence like dying stars. Below us, the doors rattled violently, something pounding against them with inhuman strength, and though I didn't dare look, I could imagine what was there. The bloated corpse pusher, the weeping mimic from room 209, the whispering shadows born from the feathers we had barely managed to burn. All of them, all of it, surging after us in a tide of hunger and hatred. Floor after floor blurred past, and somewhere in the endless spiral of terror and exhaustion, I realized that we were reaching the ground level, salvation just ahead, and with a final, desperate surge of strength, we flung ourselves through the last door, collapsing into the main lobby, which was bathed in the cold, sterile light of early dawn. The front doors were ahead, wide open, the shattered remains of the security glass glittering like ice on the polished floor, and beyond them, the pale, misty promise of the outside world. Freedom, escape, life. Janice grabbed my hand and we ran, tears streaming down our faces, gasping, sobbing, laughing with hysterical relief. And just as we crossed the threshold, just as the cool morning air kissed my skin, I heard it. One last time, the soft, familiar voice of my mother, calling my name from deep within the hospital's hollow heart. But this time, I didn't turn around. This time, I didn't look. This time, I obeyed the rules. And because I did, because we did, we survived. We never went back. We never spoke of it again. But sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness feels just a little too thick, I still hear it, a soft weeping, a slow squeal of rusted wheels, and I remember. The hospital is still there, waiting, and it never, ever forgets.